Empire of Blood. Episode 8. The Iron Man of the Army. Hideki Tojo and the Machinery of Imperial Japan. December 13th, 1937. The city of Nanjing is burning, not burning the way a house burns or a field burns. Burning the way a civilization burns when someone has decided, at the highest level, with the full administrative weight of a modern military apparatus, that the people inside it no longer deserve to live. Black smoke columns stretch for miles above the Yangtze River. They are so tall and so thick that they are visible from boats several miles downstream, from aircraft at altitude, from the hills beyond the city walls, where Chinese refugees who manage to flee watch the skyline change color and understand, without being told, what that color means. Somewhere in the city, a child is crying. Then she stops. Chinese soldiers, most of them already disarmed, are being marched in columns to the riverbank. They walk with their hands bound behind their backs with wire or rope. Some of the bindings are so tight that the men's fingers have turned blue. They do not run. Some of them have already seen what happens to the ones who run. The soldiers flanking the column are not shouting. They are not enraged. They are organized. They move with the calm efficiency of men who have been told that this is necessary, that this is what victory requires, that history will justify what is happening at the river's edge this morning. At the bank, the men are made to kneel. The killing begins. It does not happen quickly, because it is not supposed to happen quickly. It is supposed to be thorough. The officers have been briefed. The units have their assignments. The riverbank is already stained in ways that will not wash out for years, and the current carries things downstream that the fishermen in the towns below will later say they cannot describe to their children. A family is hiding in a basement on Zhongshan Road. A mother, 2 daughters, and an elderly man who cannot walk without a cane. They have been there for 3 days. They have eaten almost nothing. The eldest daughter, who is 17, has tied a cloth around her mouth and nose because of the smell that has been seeping through the floorboards and through the gaps in the basement walls. She doesn't know exactly what the smell is, but she knows she doesn't want to breathe it. They have heard things they cannot explain, not gunfire, which they expected. Gunfire is comprehensible. Gunfire is a war sound. What they have heard through the floorboards is different. It is the sound of a city being processed, methodical, unhurried, with occasional pauses that are somehow worse than the sounds themselves. They do not yet know that what they've been hearing is not the sound of war. It is the sound of what comes after war, when one side has already won and the killing continues anyway. When winning was never the point. When the point was always something else. In another part of the city, on the same morning, an American named John Robb is writing in his diary. He is a German businessman who works for Siemens. He has organized a safety zone, a few square miles of Nanjing designated as protected ground, and he is trying, with whatever authority a foreign civilian can claim, to stop what is happening. He has already tried appealing to the Japanese command structure. He has written letters, made formal complaints, used the authority of his German citizenship and his Nazi Party membership. He wears the swastika armband, a detail that history has not fully decided how to process, since the armband has given him a form of protection that has saved Chinese lives, which makes the moral accounting complicated. He will write later that the scale of what he is witnessing is something for which he has no prior category. He's a man who lived through the First World War. He has seen mass death. He has seen what artillery does to a trench line and what a gas attack does to a company of soldiers. He has the category for war. And still he cannot find the category for this. He writes the number he has estimated. He writes it, and then he stares at it. And then he writes it again. Think about that for a moment. A man who witnessed one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, sitting in a burning Chinese city, writing a number in his diary that he cannot fully believe is real. A man accustomed to horror, reaching the limit of his capacity to process horror. That is how bad this is. By the time the killing stops, if you can call it stopping, because it tapered rather than ended, wound down like a mechanism running low on fuel rather than halting by decision. The estimates will range from 100,000 to 300,000 dead. The Chinese government will settle on 300,000. Japanese nationalist historians will dispute all the figures. International scholars will argue about methodology, about what counts, so about how to estimate populations in a city where record-keeping had collapsed under bombardment. The dead will not be available to clarify. The Chinese residents of Nanjing, those who survive, will call it the Nanjing Massacre. In the West, it will become known as the Rape of Nanking, a name that is both accurate and inadequate, because what happened there was so systematically, mechanically, bureaucratically comprehensive that the word massacre doesn't contain it, and the word rape, though it describes something that happened at horrifying scale, is too specific for the full range of what was done. This is where we begin. Not with the man who authorized it. Not yet. We begin with a woman named Chen Shuying, 23 years old, a school teacher's daughter from the eastern district of Nanjing. She will survive what is coming. She will live to be 81 years old, and she will give testimony about what she saw 3 times in her life. Once to a Chinese tribunal in 1946, once to a Japanese journalist in 1982, and once to an American documentary filmmaker in 1995. Each time, she will tell exactly the same story in exactly the same sequence, pausing at exactly the same points. There is a phenomenon in trauma research where memories of extreme violence become hyper-consolidated, fixed, crystalline, immune to the normal processes of revision and softening that shape ordinary memories. Chen Shuying's account has that quality. 60 years later, the details are as sharp as they were on the day she saw them. There are things she will not say. She's very clear in each of the 3 testimonies about what she will not say. But there is one detail she returns to every time. A Japanese officer, young, she estimates 25 or 26, stood outside her family's house on the 3rd day. He had a list, a physical list, written on a paper with names or addresses or some form of catalogue that she didn't understand. He checked something on the list. He looked at the house. He made a mark. Then he moved on. She never forgot the list, because the list meant that someone, somewhere, sitting at a desk that was not in Nanjing, possibly not even in China, had thought about this, had planned for this, had created the administrative infrastructure for this. The killing wasn't passion. It wasn't soldiers losing control in the heat of battle, though some of that happened too. The killing was managed. Someone had decided in advance on a system for tracking it. The list meant the killing was managed. Hold that image. The officer, the house, the mark on the list, the movement on. His name was Hideki Tojo, not the officer with the list. He was not in Nanjing. He would never stand at a riverbank or hold a clipboard or look at the face of a family through a doorway. He was a man who worked with paper, with memos and directives and command structures and strategic doctrine and budget allocations and operational orders. He was a man who sat at tables and made decisions that flowed downward through a hierarchy until they became the officer with the list. That is what this story is about. Not Japan. Not the war as a whole, though we will need the war. Not even the massacre alone, though we will go there in detail, and it will be uncomfortable, and it should be. This is about the distance between the man at the table and the officer with the list. It's about what fills that distance. The ideology, the institution, the training, the culture, the career, the specific sequence of decisions that turns one man into the other. It's about how a man becomes the kind of man who can sit at a table and make a decision like that. What happens in a childhood, in a culture, in the particular corridors of power inside the Japanese Imperial military that produces someone capable of this? What system of belief, reward, and institutional logic makes a certain kind of violence not only possible, but rational, even noble, in its own internal logic? Because Hideki Tojo was not a monster in the way we use that word to avoid thinking. He was something more disturbing. He was a bureaucrat. He was a true believer. He was, by the standards of his world, a patriot. He went to bed at night and slept. He was devoted to his family, wrote to his children with warmth, was known among his household staff as demanding, but fair. He prayed. He had a sense of humor by some accounts, though it was narrow and dry and did not extend to his subordinates. And he made decisions that killed millions of people. Let's figure out how. But first, a word about tone. This episode is going to spend a significant amount of time inside the mind of a man who did terrible things. It is going to try to explain how he thought, why he made the choices he made, what the world looked like from where he stood. This is not the same as excusing him. Explanation is not exculpation. Understanding how something happened does not mean it was inevitable, nor that the people who made it happen bear less responsibility for making it happen. It is actually the opposite. To explain it fully and understand it completely is how we take it seriously. The comfortable story is the monster story. This man was fundamentally different from us, was motivated by drives we do not share, operated in a moral universe so alien to ours that his choices have no real relationship to the choices ordinary people make. The monster story lets us off the hook. It says, this is what evil looks like, and evil looks like that, not like us, not like anything we are at risk of becoming or enabling or failing to stop. The uncomfortable story is the one we are going to tell. This man was not a monster. He was a product. He was built by specific historical forces, specific institutions, specific ideologies, specific incentives. Those forces, institutions, ideologies, and incentives are not unique to Japan in the 1930s. They are recurring features of human political and military organization, appearing in different forms in different times and places, producing different specific outcomes but following the same underlying logic. That is why this matters. That is why the 42 minutes before this story ends, the 6 weeks in Nanjing, the years in Manchuria, the list in the officer's hands, are worth understanding as carefully as we can. Let's figure out how. To understand Hideki Tojo, you have to understand the world that made him possible, and to understand that world you have to begin with a moment of terror. Not Japan's terror inflicted on others. Japan's terror at its own potential destruction. July 8th, 1853. The 4 black ships appear in Edo Bay. They are American warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry, and they carry something Japan has never encountered before: steam-powered engines that do not depend on wind, and cannons that fire explosive shells rather than solid shot. The gap between the American armament and anything the Tokugawa shogunate can deploy is not a gap of degree. It is a gap of kind. Japan looks at these 4 ships and understands, in the way you understand something when the evidence is standing in your harbor, that its entire civilization is exposed. Perry delivers a letter from President Millard Fillmore. It says, in diplomatic language that does not obscure its meaning, that Japan should open its ports to American trade, that the world is changing, that isolation is not viable. The shogunate, which has ruled a closed island nation for over 200 years, has no good options. They know what happened to China. Specifically, they know what happened in 1842, when the British Empire forced China to sign the Treaty of Nanking after the First Opium War. The treaty ceded Hong Kong, opened 5 ports to British trade, granted British nationals immunity from Chinese courts on Chinese soil, and imposed an indemnity that bled the Chinese treasury for years. The most powerful empire in Asia, a civilization of incomprehensible antiquity, reduced to signing a document that defined the terms of its own sovereignty for it, forced to accept in writing the limits of what it was allowed to be. Japan watched this happen. The lesson was not subtle. The lesson was, modernize or be colonized. Say, build the weapons or become subject to the weapons someone else built. There was no third option. The world the European powers had created did not have a space for a nation that chose to remain outside the logic of industrial military power. That space had been eliminated, and anyone who did not understand this had only to look at China. And so Japan made a choice that would shape everything that came after. It chose to become an empire. The choice deserves to be examined slowly because it is not as obvious as it sounds. Japan had other options, at least in theory. It could have attempted the path of accommodation that China tried and failed at, accepting Western economic penetration in exchange for nominal sovereignty. It could have attempted the path of some smaller Asian states, and which survived by being useful to Western powers rather than threatening to them. These options were available. The men who led Japan in the Meiji period rejected them, and they rejected them for reasons that were not simply nationalistic pride. They rejected them because they had studied what happened to countries that tried accommodation. China had tried accommodation and had been progressively dismembered. India had been absorbed. Burma had been annexed. The Vietnamese had been colonized. The pattern was consistent. Accommodation to Western power was a process of incremental surrender that ended in the loss of sovereignty. There was no stable equilibrium in which a non-industrialized Asian state maintained its independence through cooperation. The Western powers were not interested in cooperative arrangements, and they were interested in markets, resources, and strategic position, and they would take what they needed by whatever means were available to them. The Meiji oligarchs understood this with the clarity of people who had been personally threatened by it. The men who drove the Meiji transformation were pragmatists who looked at the world as it was and made calculations about survival. The calculation said, become like the threat or be consumed by it. And so Japan became like the threat. There was genius in this. The speed of the transformation, the quality of the institutional learning, the willingness to abandon traditional structures that were not serving the new purpose. These reflect a governing class of remarkable capability. Japan in 1905 was the most rapidly modernized country in history, and the men who built it deserved the admiration they received. But the genius was in service of a goal that contained within it the seeds of catastrophe. Because the thing Japan had decided to become was a 19th century European empire, and the 19th century European empire was already beginning to reveal its own logic of escalation, of violence that could not be contained once set in motion, of contradictions between the universal values the empires proclaimed and the specific practices they required. Japan absorbed the model and the contradiction simultaneously, and then it ran the model forward in time. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was not a restoration in the sense of returning to what had been. It was a transformation, one of the most deliberate and rapid transformations of a society in recorded human history. The Emperor Meiji was restored to effective power after centuries of shogunate rule. The ruling class that came with him immediately set about remaking Japan from the outside in. Delegations were sent to Prussia to study military organization, to Britain to study the navy and industrial production, to France to study legal systems and education, to America to study commerce and constitutional government. They came home and built railroads, telegraphs, banks, universities, modern hospitals, conscript armies, an imperial navy, and a legal code. Within a single generation, Japan moved from feudal isolation to industrialized statehood. The scale of this achievement is genuinely astonishing, but there is no other example in modern history of a non-Western nation accomplishing something comparable in the same time frame without being forced to do so at gunpoint. Japan chose this. It chose it deliberately, methodically, with a clarity about what was at stake that its ruling class never lost sight of. And embedded in this achievement, right from the beginning, was a contradiction that would eventually produce Hideki Tojo and everything that followed him. The contradiction was this: Japan modernized in order to preserve itself, but preservation required becoming powerful. Becoming powerful required expansion. Expansion required an empire, and building an empire meant doing to other people exactly what Japan had feared would be done to it. The ruling class understood this. They were not naive about the moral asymmetry. So they looked at the British Empire and the French Empire and the Russian Empire expanding across Asia, and they said, "This is how the world operates. If we want to survive with our dignity intact, we have to operate by the same logic. We have to become one of these." And layered on top of this strategic calculation was something ideological. Japan didn't just want power, it wanted recognition. It wanted to be acknowledged as a civilization equal to the Western nations that had forced open its ports, and the Western powers kept withholding that recognition in ways that were so systematic they began to look like policy rather than oversight. The triple intervention of 1895, when Russia, France and Germany jointly pressured Japan to return territory it had just won from China in the First Sino-Japanese War. It was experienced in Japan as a profound humiliation. Japan had won the war. It had fought, bled, and prevailed. And then 3 European powers had gathered around a table, calculated that Japan's gains threatened the balance of their own interests, and told Japan to give it back. And Japan gave it back because it had no choice, because the 3 powers threatening it could back their displeasure with warships. This is an experience that does something to a nation's psychology. Then the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, which set the ratio of capital ships Japan was allowed to build relative to Britain and America at 3-to-5. 3-to-5. Arithmetic applied to sovereignty, written into international law, telling Japan exactly what fraction of equality it was permitted to claim. Then the Immigration Act of 1924, which effectively barred Japanese immigration to the United States at a moment when Japanese communities in California had built prosperous, stable lives over 2 generations and were being told by congressional legislation that they were not welcome, that they were a different category of person. These are not ancient slights. The men who ran Japan in the 1930s lived through these things. They remembered them. They discussed them in the staff rooms of the army and in the smoke-filled salons where policy was made, and the memory gave a sharp edge to the ideology of expansion that might otherwise have remained more theoretical. Now add Pan-Asianism, the doctrine that Japan was not merely an empire building for itself, but the natural leader and liberator of all Asian peoples, standing against Western colonialism. This was both a strategic justification for expansion and, for many of the men who espoused it, a sincere belief. Japan genuinely did regard Western colonialism in Asia with something that looked like moral outrage, and some of the language its spokesman used about ending Western domination would not have sounded out of place in an anti-colonial manifesto. The problem, which is obvious in retrospect and was obvious to contemporaries who were not Japanese, was that Japan's liberation of Asia from Western colonialism consistently involved replacing Western occupation with Japanese occupation, Western extraction with Japanese extraction, and Western contempt for Asian peoples with Japanese contempt for Asian peoples who were not Japanese. The Koreans, occupied since 1910, were not liberated. The Chinese were not liberated. The peoples of Southeast Asia, however much they initially greeted Japanese forces as preferable to French or Dutch colonizers, discovered fairly quickly that they had exchanged one form of domination for another that could be considerably more violent. But the doctrine was believed. That is the important thing. The men who built the Japanese military machine in the 1930s genuinely believed that what they were doing was historically righteous. And then there is Bushido. In its original form, the code of the samurai warrior was a complex ethical system developed over centuries, emphasizing loyalty to one's lord, personal honor, skill in martial arts, and a relationship to death that accepted it without fear. There is genuine depth in the tradition, and historians who have studied it have noted that in its original formulation, it also contained significant elements of mercy, restraint, and respect for the defeated. The samurai tradition, at its most developed, was not simply about killing. It was about the cultivation of a certain quality of person. What happened to Bushido in the Meiji era was that it was nationalized. The Meiji state needed an ideology for its conscript army, an army drawn from the entire male population rather than from a hereditary warrior class. It needed to give rice farmers and merchant sons the psychological framework of samurai soldiers. It selected the elements of Bushido that were most useful for this purpose. The elements about loyalty and self-sacrifice and the acceptance of death were elevated and simplified. The elements about restraint and mercy were not. What emerged from military training by the early 20th century was a version of Bushido in which the core moral fact was this: death in service to the emperor is the highest possible good, and surrender is not merely defeat, but spiritual annihilation. You have to sit with the implications of that. When a military culture decides that surrender is worse than death, it is making several decisions simultaneously. It is deciding that its soldiers will fight to the last man in circumstances where another army would yield, which means the wars it fights will be extraordinarily costly. It is deciding something about the moral status of the enemy. If surrender is dishonorable, then the enemy soldier who surrenders has forfeited the respect one warrior owes another. He is not a prisoner of war in the legal and moral sense. He is something that has removed itself from the category of honorable adversary and placed itself in a different category entirely. And it is deciding something about civilians in occupied territories who are even further from the category of honorable adversary, and whose suffering registers within this framework as a management problem rather than a moral one. This is not speculation about what individual soldiers felt. This is documented, institutionalized, written into training manuals, field regulations, and operational doctrine. Japanese military training materials from the 1930s are explicit about the inferior moral status of non-Japanese peoples. They use specific, unflattering language about Chinese soldiers. and they frame the enemy in ways that are designed to prevent empathy. By the time Hideki Tojo enters this picture, these forces have been compounding for 60 years. Japan has won the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895 and been humiliated at the negotiating table afterward. It has won the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, the first time in the modern era that an Asian power defeated a major European state in a full-scale conflict. A victory that electrified independence movements across Asia and unnerved European capitals in ways that they did not fully acknowledge. It has annexed Korea in 1910 over the protests of the Korean government, which was then dissolved. It has participated in the First World War on the Allied side, seized German colonial possessions in the Pacific and China. You can arrive at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 expecting to be received as a great power equal. It was not. By the 1930s, civilian government in Japan has been thoroughly destabilized. Successive prime ministers have been unable to control the military or to build coalitions capable of resisting expansionist pressure. The men who do control things are army officers, and increasingly, they are army officers who have given up on parliamentary process and who are prepared to use assassination to remove politicians who stand in the way of what they believe Japan must do. In 1932, a group of young naval officers assassinated Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi in his own home. They walked in during a private meeting, demanded to speak with him, and shot him when negotiations failed. At their trial, they received sympathetic public coverage. Letters of support arrived in the thousands. 9,000 people cut off their own fingers and mailed them to the court as gestures of solidarity with the assassins. 9,000 fingers. Think about what that means. Not the grotesquerie of it, though that is present. Think about what it means about the political culture of Japan in 1932. 9,000 ordinary citizens, not military men, not ideologues in any formal sense, but ordinary people, so deeply identified with the expansionist military agenda that they performed an act of deliberate, permanent self-mutilation to express support for men who had murdered the head of government. This is the world Hideki Tojo moves through. Not the world of a rogue or an outlier. The world of a system. The empire does not need a monster. It needs a manager. And it needs someone who can take everything, the ideology, the institutions, the myth, the resentment, the ambition, and turn it into operational decisions. Someone who can sit at the table, look at the map and say, here is what we need to do next, and here is how we do it. And here is who is responsible for each component, and here is how we measure success. It finds exactly that man. Hideki Tojo was born on December 30th, 1884, in Tokyo, the third son of Hidenori Tojo, a lieutenant general in the Imperial Japanese Army. This is not a minor biographical detail. This is the entire frame. Hideki Tojo was born into the military the way other men are born into the church or into commerce or into the land. The army was not a career he would choose. It was a world he would inherit. The values of that world, discipline, hierarchy, obedience, the subordination of individual will to institutional purpose, were not doctrines he would be taught. They were the atmosphere he breathed. His father had risen from the low-ranked samurai class, the kind of family that had status but not wealth in the old Tokugawa order, and had found in the Meiji army a new architecture for the old values. The Imperial Army took former samurai families and gave them a place where their martial tradition was not merely preserved, but made central, made sacred, made the organizing principle of a new national project. Hidenori Tojo had fought. He had proven himself. He had given his son a world with clear rules. The rules. Obey your superiors absolutely. Execute your mission without hesitation or complaint. Honor the emperor above all things. Show no weakness in any form. The rewards. Rank, respect, and authority, the deep satisfaction of belonging to an institution that regarded itself as the backbone of a civilization. Hideki Tojo absorbed these rules the way children absorb everything, not as doctrine, but as reality. Not as a set of choices, but as the nature of things. He was not a particularly remarkable child by any account. His schoolmates at the Army Preparatory Academy did not note him as brilliant or charismatic or possessed of unusual gifts. What they noted was simpler. He worked. He was relentless about it. Where other students might rely on natural aptitude or family connections, Tojo relied on discipline, effort, and an almost mechanical commitment to doing whatever was required. He is sometimes compared in this regard to a certain type of institutional climber, the person who arrives first and leaves last, and who follows procedure without creative deviation, who earns advancement not through inspiration, but through absolute reliability. Except the institution was the Imperial Japanese Army, and reliability in that context meant something specific and consequential. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1905 at the age of 20, in the same season that Japan was defeating Russia at Mukden and the Tsushima Strait. He could not have timed his entry into professional life better if he had arranged it. Japan was at the apex of its self-confidence, the military establishment intoxicated with the conviction that Japanese martial culture was not merely comparable to the West, but superior to it in the ways that mattered most. The Battle of Tsushima, where Admiral Togo Heihachiro's fleet destroyed almost the entire Russian Baltic fleet in a single afternoon, had produced a kind of national ecstasy that young officers like Tojo carried with them throughout their careers. What Tsushima had proved, in the military's reading of it, was that spirit defeated numbers, that Japanese discipline and morale and martial character could overcome the material advantages of a larger, richer European power. This reading was not entirely wrong. Discipline and morale matter enormously in warfare. But the reading contained a dangerous seed, the conviction that these qualities were sufficient, that the material calculus of modern industrial war could be overcome by the right kind of soldier with the right kind of commitment. Our Tojo spent the next decade moving through the standard postings of a capable junior officer. He served in staff roles, administrative assignments, the grinding institutional labor of an army bureaucracy. He was not a frontline hero. He was never particularly associated with battlefield glory. What he was, increasingly, was someone the institution trusted, someone who understood how the machine worked and could make it work better. His nickname, by the late 1910s, was already circulating, Kamisori Tojo, Razor Tojo. The name captured his administrative sharpness, his intolerance for sloppiness, his capacity to cut through complexity and produce clarity. But it also captured something about his relationship with other people. A razor is precise and useful and cold. It does not consider the feelings of what it cuts. In 1919, so he was sent to Germany as a military attaché. He was 35 years old, already a capable officer with good reviews, but not yet someone identified as particularly exceptional. The posting to Germany was routine. What was not routine was the Germany he arrived in. It is difficult to convey what Germany in 1919 felt like from the inside. The Kaiser had abdicated. The empire was finished. The streets of Berlin were full of demobilized soldiers who had been told they were winning until they suddenly weren't. Revolutionary uprisings had been violently suppressed in the same weeks that the armistice was being signed. Inflation was beginning its catastrophic ascent. The Weimar Republic was trying to establish itself in a country that had not voted for it and did not, in large parts, want it. And the humiliation of Versailles was being processed in 100 different ways by 100 different factions, and the unifying thread through almost all of them was a single anguished question: how did we lose? The stab-in-the-back answer: that Germany's military had been undefeated in the field and had been betrayed by civilians, by socialists, by Jews, by the weakness of parliamentary government, was not yet the organized political doctrine it would become. But it was in the air. It was what men at bar tables said. It was what former officers wrote in their memoirs. It was the emotional logic of a military culture that could not integrate the fact of its own defeat. Tojo spent 3 years in this environment. He absorbed several things. He absorbed the doctrine of total war, and the idea that modern industrial conflict required the complete mobilization of a nation's economic, psychological, and human resources. He absorbed the lesson that civilian governments were a liability in wartime, that the interference of parliamentary politics in military decision-making was a structural vulnerability that any serious military state should eliminate. And he absorbed, perhaps most fatefully, the lesson of what happens when a military machine is not given complete authority to do what it believes is necessary to win. He would spend the rest of his career trying to ensure that Japan never repeated Germany's mistake. Back in Japan through the 1920s, Tojo moved steadily upward through the staff hierarchy. His reviews consistently cited the same qualities: disciplined, thorough, demanding, loyal. Not brilliant, not creative, and the word that appears most often in the language of Japanese military evaluation is kakoi, capable, which is the highest praise in an institutional culture that distrusts showiness. He was exactly what the institution needed at the level he occupied. His ideology was hardening. Tojo aligned himself with the Imperial Way faction, the grouping within the army that believed Japan's destiny was total domination of East Asia under the divine authority of the emperor, and that the path to that destiny required eliminating the political obstacles, the liberal politicians, the civilian moderates, the Western-oriented business interests that stood in its way. He was not, however, associated with the most violent wing of this faction, the young officers who believed in achieving this through assassination and coup. Tojo was not a revolutionary. He was, in this as in everything, institutional. He wanted to remake the state from inside the state, using the legitimate authority of the army to gradually eliminate the civilian power centers that constrained it. This distinction between the violent revolutionary and the institutional incrementalist is important. It is part of why Tojo rose so far. The violent revolutionaries were useful for intimidating politicians and demonstrating the military's willingness to use force, but they were disruptive and unpredictable. Tojo was neither. He was the man you sent to manage things after the revolutionaries had done their work. He was the man who made the machine run. In 1933, he was appointed head of the Kempei Tai in Manchuria. The Kempei Tai was the military police of the Imperial Japanese Army, and in Japan itself, it functioned as a kind of internal security service, monitoring political dissent, enforcing military discipline, and conducting surveillance of the civilian population. In Manchuria, which Japan had seized in 1931 through the staged Mukden incident and had reorganized as the puppet state of Manchukuo, the Kempei Tai was the instrument of occupation. It arrested, interrogated, imprisoned, and executed. It suppressed resistance movements, managed forced labor, and maintained the security architecture that kept Manchukuo functioning as a resource extraction colony for Japan. Tojo ran it methodically. He expanded the network of informants. He systematized interrogation procedures. He organized the suppression of Chinese resistance with what his superiors described, approvingly, as machine-like efficiency. And he reorganized the filing system for intelligence reports. He created clearer accountability structures so that information flowed upward through the hierarchy without distortion. He addressed the problem of overlapping jurisdictions between different units of the security apparatus. He was, in short, an excellent administrator of an apparatus of terror. He did not, as far as the record shows, personally conduct interrogations or executions. He managed the people who did. He created the organizational structure within which atrocity was conducted consistently, effectively, and with minimal administrative friction. He was the kind of man who made torture more efficient without touching anyone. This is the moment to say something that matters. There is a persistent, comforting fantasy in how we think about men like Tojo. The fantasy is that somewhere, in some private moment, they know what they're doing is wrong. That beneath the ideology and the institutional role, there is a suppressed conscience, a buried moral awareness that they are choosing to ignore. That if you could just strip away the doctrine and the uniform and the career, you'd find a man who understands, on some level, that the people in the basement of the Kempitai building are human beings. The evidence does not support this fantasy. Tojo's private correspondence from this period shows no trace of conflict or suppressed doubt. In letters to his wife, Katsuko, he writes about his work with the focused satisfaction of a man solving a management problem. The Chinese population of Manchuria appears in his descriptions not with cruelty, exactly, but with a categorical flatness. They are variables to be managed, sources of potential instability to be neutralized. When the management problem requires killing, the killing is noted, evaluated for effectiveness, and moved past. He is not performing indifference to impress his superiors. The indifference is real. This is not psychopathy in the clinical sense. Psychopathy is the absence of empathic capacity as a neurological fact, present from birth and independent of experience. What Tojo exhibits is something considerably more common and more frightening. The moral narrowing that results from complete immersion in a closed institutional world that provides its own complete system of values, its own definitions of what matters and what doesn't, its own categories for sorting human beings into those whose suffering has moral weight and those whose suffering doesn't. The Japanese Imperial Army had spent decades constructing exactly this system. The training, the doctrine, the mythology, the daily rituals of deference and obedience, the language that described occupied peoples in specific ways that removed them from the category of persons with rights. All of this, accumulated over a career, produced men for whom the question of whether a Chinese civilian's life had value simply did not arise in the form that it arises for us. The question was not available. The categories didn't exist. By 1937, Tojo was a lieutenant general commanding Japanese forces in northern China as the Second Sino-Japanese War began with the Marco Polo Bridge incident of July 7th. He was not in Nanjing when the massacre happened. The direct command responsibility for Nanjing falls on Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, the emperor's uncle, and on the theater commander General Matsui Iwane. But Tojo was part of the same institutional apparatus, operating under the same command structure, following the same operational doctrine, and producing the same kinds of outcomes in his theater. He knew what was happening. He did not object. He was promoted. In 1938, Vice Minister of War. In 1939, Inspector General of Army Aviation. In 1940, Minister of War in the Second Konoe cabinet. Each promotion was a validation of his approach, a signal from the institution that the way he did things was the way the institution wanted things done. By 1940, the strategic landscape has transformed in ways that fill the Japanese military's establishment with a dangerous kind of optimism. Germany has conquered France in 6 weeks. Britain is fighting for its survival. The Netherlands has fallen. The French, Dutch, and British empires in Asia, Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, Burma, Borneo, are suddenly exposed. The colonial masters are either defeated or fully occupied elsewhere. The resources Japan needs to sustain its military machine, primarily oil and rubber and iron ore, are sitting in those territories under thin occupation within operational reach. Tojo sees this clearly. Japan signs the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy in September 1940. Tojo supports it enthusiastically, as does the army broadly. The logic is straightforward. Align with the winning side. Use the window created by the European War to secure the resource base Japan has always needed. Present America with a fait accompli before it can mobilize its industrial capacity in opposition. The risk in this calculation is the United States, and Tojo knows it. America has been watching Japan's expansion with increasing alarm throughout the 1930s. The Panay Incident of 1937, when Japanese aircraft sank an American gunboat on the Yangtze River, had produced a diplomatic crisis that was resolved only by Japanese apology and compensation. American public opinion, never particularly supportive of Japanese expansion, had hardened after Nanjing, the details of which were being reported by Western journalists in the city, including the journalist F. Tillman Durdeen of the New York Times, to whose dispatches described what he saw with a directness that disturbed American readers. Roosevelt's response to Japan's move into French Indochina in July 1941 is an oil embargo, combined with a freeze on Japanese assets in American banks. Japan imports approximately 80% of its petroleum from the United States. This is not a complication in Japan's strategic planning. This is an existential threat in slow motion. With existing reserves, Japan has perhaps 2 years before the military machine begins to shut down. The Navy's ships, the Army's trucks and tanks, the Air Force's aircraft, all of them stop when the oil stops. The clock is now running. Tojo becomes Prime Minister in October 1941, being appointed by Emperor Hirohito after the previous cabinet collapsed under the weight of the deadlock between those who wanted to negotiate with America and those who believed negotiation would only produce worse terms. Hirohito chose Tojo specifically, it is thought, because he believed Tojo would conduct a comprehensive review of Japan's options before committing to war, and possibly because he hoped Tojo's authority within the military would allow him to restrain it if a decision for peace was reached. Tojo conducted the review. He was thorough about it, as he was thorough about everything. He consulted the admirals and the economists and the planners. He reviewed the oil reserve projections. He reviewed the diplomatic options, which the Americans had made clear required Japan to withdraw from China entirely as a precondition for lifting the embargo, which Japan's military leadership was not going to accept. He ran the numbers in every direction he could run them. And then he concluded, negotiate, and Japan accepts slow strangulation on American terms. Wait, and the oil runs out before any military option is viable. Strike first, take the southern resource zone, present America with a war it will eventually tire of, and negotiate peace from a position of strength. This was not an irrational analysis, given his assumptions. The fatal assumption was that America, once hit, would look at the cost of reconquering the Pacific and decide it wasn't worth it. That assumption was wrong. American public opinion after Pearl Harbor did not calculate cost and benefit. Some had demanded victory. Tojo had run the numbers correctly, but had gotten the human variable catastrophically wrong. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft hit Pearl Harbor. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia at a speed that stunned everyone, including the Japanese planners who had designed the campaigns. Hong Kong fell December 25th. Manila fell January 2nd. The supposedly impregnable British fortress of Singapore fell February 15th, 1942. With over 80,000 British, Australian and Indian troops surrendering in what Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Dutch East Indies fell in March. Burma was taken. The Japanese advance reached the borders of India, and Imperial Japan, at its maximum extent, controlled a territory stretching from the borders of the Soviet Union to the frontiers of Australia. This is when Tojo is most powerful, and this is when he is most dangerous. He is simultaneously Prime Minister, Minister of War, Home Minister, and eventually Chief of the Army General Staff. No one in Japan has held this concentration of authority since the shogun. He uses it to pursue total war mobilization, conscripting labor, directing industrial production, suppressing dissent, managing the occupied territories through whatever means are necessary to extract maximum resources at minimum cost. Maximum resources, minimum cost. That is the calculation. The people in the occupied territories are part of the cost calculation. The tide turns at Midway in June 1942, although the Japanese public is not told this. The loss of 4 fleet carriers in a single engagement shifts the balance of naval air power in the Pacific in ways that cannot be recovered. After Guadalcanal, after the grinding island-hopping campaigns of 1943 and 1944, after Saipan falls in July 1944 and brings American B-29s within range of the Japanese home islands, the military reality is clear to everyone who is allowed to see the actual figures. Tojo resigns as Prime Minister on July 18, 1944. He does so because the fall of Saipan has cost him the political support he needs, not because he has concluded the war was wrong. He still believes the war was right. He will say so under oath at the tribunal that will eventually try him for his life. He has started a war he could not win. He has burned through the lives of millions of people, and he has failed at the one thing he was supposed to accomplish. He failed completely. But before we close this chapter of his life and turn to the machine he built, there is something worth examining about the private Hideki Tojo, the man who existed alongside the administrator and the ideologue. He was married to Katsuko, whom he had wed in 1909, and by all accounts the marriage was one of deep and genuine affection. He wrote to her when he was away on posting with a frequency and warmth that surprised the officers who served under him, who had seen only the razor. His letters to his children were attentive to the details of their lives, in ways that suggest a man who was present as a father, not merely as a distant authority. He cooked occasionally. He enjoyed simple food. He did not drink heavily. He did not have affairs, or if he did, they are not in the record. This domestic warmth is not a mitigating factor. It is an aggravating one. The man who wrote tender letters to his children from Manchuria was the same man who was systematically organizing the suppression of the Manchurian Chinese population in the building down the street. These two things coexisted without, as far as the evidence shows, any particular strain. The father and the administrator were not in conflict. They occupied separate compartments of a life organized in a way that prevented them from meeting. Hannah Arendt, writing about Adolf Eichmann 20 years after Tojo's execution, identified something she called the banality of evil. The idea that great harm is often done not by monsters in the theatrical sense, but by ordinary men who have simply suspended the faculty of thought, who have surrendered the capacity for independent moral judgment to an institution and an ideology, who are doing their jobs. The concept has been critiqued and refined in the decades since, and some scholars argue it goes too far in the direction of reducing perpetrators to thoughtless mechanisms when the evidence shows more deliberate calculation. But something in Arendt's observation applies to Tojo, even if the application requires modification. Tojo was not thoughtless. He was extremely thoughtful within his framework. He thought carefully and systematically about military strategy, about political maneuvering, about administrative efficiency, about the best way to pursue Japan's imperial project. What he did not think about, what the framework he operated within did not require him to think about, this was the experience of the people on the other side of his decisions. They were not available to be thought about in that way. They existed in the reports as variables. The thinking that mattered happened before those variables appeared, when the ideology was constructed that assigned them their categorical status. Tojo had a particular relationship with paper that is worth understanding. He generated it in extraordinary quantities and read it with extraordinary attention. Subordinates who served under him in the war ministry describe a man who arrived before anyone else and worked through stacks of documents with focused methodicality that other officers found either impressive or exhausting. He annotated everything. He had opinions about the formatting of reports. He could recall in meetings the specific wording of documents he had read weeks earlier. He is described in several memoirs by contemporaries as a man who was most himself in a room full of documents, who came alive in the particular way that certain people come alive when they are managing complexity. The reports flowing in from occupied territories were not, to Tojo, windows onto human reality. They were data. They described conditions, identified problems, proposed solutions, measured outcomes. When a report described the pacification of a district in Manchuria, it described it in the language of military operations, and Tojo read it in that language, annotated it in that language, and filed it. The gap between the language of the report and the reality of the district, the actual human reality of what pacification meant to the people being pacified, was a gap that the institutional language was designed to maintain, and Tojo had spent his entire career inside institutions that maintained it. He did not lack imagination. The transcripts of his speeches to military audiences show a man capable of vivid, emotionally affecting rhetoric when the purpose called for it. He could describe Japan's destiny in terms that moved people. He could describe the sacrifices of fallen soldiers in ways that made hardened officers lower their eyes. The imagination was there. It was selectively applied, directed toward the institution and its goals. It was not directed toward imagining the experience of the people the institution was harming. And this selective deployment of imagination is one of the most precise descriptions of how institutional atrocity is psychologically sustained. The men at the top do not need to be incapable of imagining suffering. They need only to have constructed, over years of institutional life, a framework in which the suffering of certain people does not activate the imagination in the way that the suffering of the right people does. The training, the language, the ideology, the daily rituals of the institution all work together to produce and maintain this selective blindness. It is not accidental. It is engineered. Tojo's engineered blindness held until the end. He was not the kind of man who, under the weight of defeat and imprisonment, came to see his victims as human beings. Some perpetrators do this. There are documented cases of men who participated in mass violence and who, later, in circumstances that gave them space to think differently, arrived at some form of reckoning. Tojo is not one of these. His final years, between his arrest in September 1945 and his execution in December 1948, show a man who processed his situation as a legal and political problem, who engaged with his defense with the same methodical competence he had applied to military administration, and who arrived at the gallows still convinced in the deepest sense that he had been right. That conviction is the most disturbing thing about him. Not the crimes, though the crimes are monstrous. The conviction, because the crimes are historical. They happened, and the people who suffered them are beyond suffering now. But the conviction, the psychological and ideological structure that made the crimes possible, that made them feel not just permissible but necessary, is not historical. It is a template. It is something that can be reinstalled in different hardware, in different times, in different places, whenever the conditions are right. Understanding Tojo means understanding how the template works. Not to excuse him, not to reduce him to his circumstances, rather than his choices. He made choices. He made them repeatedly, over decades at each of the many junctures where a different choice was available. He chose the brutal route consistently enough that the word choice eventually seems inadequate. It was not choosing in any normal sense because it was not deliberating between live options, and it was acting in accordance with a self that had been constructed layer by layer to produce exactly this. He failed completely. The Nanjing Massacre did not happen because soldiers lost control. That is the explanation that has been offered repeatedly in the decades since, by Japanese nationalist historians, by apologists, by people who need the violence to have been aberrational rather than systemic. Because if it was systemic, then the questions it raises cannot be contained and disposed of. The loss of control argument says, war is terrible. Soldiers do terrible things in the heat of battle. What happened in Nanjing was the awful but understandable extreme of that universal truth. The argument fails on a single fact. The massacre lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks. That is not a loss of control. A loss of control is hours, maybe days, but in the most extreme cases. 6 weeks is a sustained institutional decision made and remade every day for 42 days by officers at every level of the command hierarchy who could see what was happening and chose to allow it to continue. 6 weeks is a policy. It may not have been articulated as a policy in a single explicit document, though some documents come very close. But it was functionally a policy because it continued systematically with organizational support across 6 weeks and across multiple units and across multiple categories of victim. Let's be precise about how it worked. The Japanese Central China Area Army, under overall theater command of General Matsui Iwane, captured Nanjing on December the 13th. 1937. The city had been defended by Chinese nationalist forces under General Tang Shengji, who ordered a fighting retreat and then fled in a way that left large portions of his army effectively leaderless. Somewhere between 90,000 and 150,000 Chinese soldiers and militia were in or around the city. The Japanese attacking force numbered roughly 50,000. The first problem the Japanese command faced in the immediate aftermath of capture was what to do with the prisoners. Under international law as it existed in 1937, captured soldiers were prisoners of war, entitled to food, shelter, humane treatment, and the right not to be executed. Japan had signed, but with significant reservations, never fully ratified the Geneva Conventions in ways that made these protections binding. But beyond the legal question was a practical one that the field commanders addressed explicitly in their communications. a large population of disarmed but potentially rearmable Chinese soldiers was a security problem. Released, they might regroup. Imprisoned, they required guards and supplies the army hadn't provisioned for. The solution the command chose was systematic execution. Captain Tanaka Gunkichi of the 16th Division testified after the war that he received explicit orders to kill all prisoners. Not to release them, not to imprison them, to kill them. He described the method and the logistics. Prisoners were marched to the riverbank or to open ground outside the city walls and killed by machine gun or bayonet, the method varying by unit and circumstance. The use of machine guns was assessed as a resource problem. I read that again. The use of machine guns to kill prisoners was assessed as a resource problem, specifically because it consumed ammunition at a rate that affected the Army's supply situation. Alternative methods were therefore explored and implemented. This is recorded in after-action reports. It is framed as a logistical consideration. This is the language of administration applied to mass murder. It is important to understand what that language means and doesn't mean. It means that the people making these decisions were not in a state of passion or rage or temporary moral breakdown. They were doing their jobs. They were applying the same analytical framework to the disposal of prisoners that they would apply to the movement of supplies or the rotation of units. And the problem of what to do with the prisoners was solved the way problems were solved in the Japanese military, efficiently, thoroughly, with attention to resource constraints. The civilian population of Nanjing was processed through a different but parallel logic. Civilians who were associated, or suspected of being associated, with Chinese military forces were categorized as security threats and treated accordingly. Civilians who were not security threats were, in the institutional calculus of the occupation, available to the army in whatever way the army found useful. The city had been taken. Its population was property of the victor, in the framework the army was operating within. The concept that civilian populations in captured cities retained rights, the right not to be killed, not to be raped, not to have their property taken, and not to be used as targets for bayonet training, was not a concept that this framework recognized. Two Japanese officers, Mukai Toshiaki and Noda Tsuyoshi, held a competition documented and reported in the Tokyo Nichi Nichi Shimbun newspaper to determine who could first kill 100 people with a sword. The newspaper covered the competition with the enthusiasm it might apply to a sporting event. Progress reports were filed as the officers advanced toward their tallies. When Mukai reached 105 and Noda 106, with some dispute about the exact moment each passed 100, they agreed to extend the competition to 150. The newspaper reported this cheerfully, with the officers' names and their running scores. Stop with that for a moment. This was in a newspaper, not whispered between soldiers, not concealed from the Japanese public, and printed in a major daily newspaper, with the officers' names as a story of military accomplishment, which means the editors of that newspaper made a decision. The decision was, this is a story our readers will find interesting rather than horrifying. This is the kind of story that represents Japanese military achievement in a way that our readers will respond to positively. That decision tells you more about the institutional culture of Japan in 1937 than almost any policy document. It tells you that the killing of Chinese people, in sufficient numbers with sufficient martial flair, had been normalized in Japanese public culture to the point where it could be presented as entertainment. The machinery of the massacre operated on multiple levels simultaneously, and it is important to trace all of them, because understanding the machine requires seeing the whole machine and not just the part that kills. At the top of the hierarchy sat the command structure. Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, the emperor's uncle and commander of the Shanghai Expeditionary Force, issued orders on December 13th that Allied investigators later recovered. The orders are precise. All captives are to be killed. There are no exceptions for officers, which was sometimes a point of distinction in earlier Japanese military practice that gave senior officers a degree of protection. All captives. The word used for captives covers both soldiers and a broader category that in context encompasses the disarmed and the civilian. General Matsui, the theater commander, later expressed private discomfort with the scale of what was happening, and he wrote in his diary that it was a blot on the reputation of the Imperial Army. He is sometimes cited as evidence that the massacre was not universally endorsed within the command structure, but this citation requires ignoring the obvious. Matsui commanded the theater. He could have issued orders stopping it. He did not. Private discomfort that produces no action is indistinguishable from complicity, and in a military context with clear chains of command, a commander's failure to stop what his units are doing is not discomfort. It is authorization. At the operational level, divisional and regimental commanders received the directives from above and translated them into specific assignments. Units were tasked with specific areas of the city, specific categories of prisoner. Some commanders participated with evident enthusiasm. Others were more mechanical about it, conducting the operations with the flat professionalism that the system produced and rewarded. The evidence for any commander having actively resisted is thin. The evidence for commanders having exceeded their orders in the direction of greater violence is substantial. At the individual level, the soldiers who carried out the killing were, for the most part, young men from rural Japan who had been subjected to years of training designed to accomplish specific psychological goals. The training had made them obedient in ways that went beyond simple discipline, had instilled a fear of disobeying orders that operated more like a physiological reflex than a conscious calculation, and it had also done something more deliberate and more systematic. It had removed from their psychological toolkit the categories through which sympathy for Chinese people might have been activated. Through language, through imagery, through explicit instruction, the Chinese enemy had been placed in a category below the moral threshold at which empathy operates. There were soldiers who refused to participate. There were not many. The consequences for refusal ranged from social ostracism within the unit to physical punishment to, in some documented cases, execution. The few cases of Japanese soldiers who tried to protect Chinese civilians are notable precisely because they are so rare, and because in each documented case the soldier acted at significant personal risk and without institutional support. The system punished mercy. It punished the impulse toward mercy with social consequences, with institutional consequences, with career consequences, and when necessary, with violent consequences. This is not an abstract claim. It is documented in the testimonies of soldiers who survived and were willing to speak. Sergeant Azuma Shiro was one of them. He was a machine gunner with the 16th Division during the Nanjing campaign, and he testified, after the war, about what he had participated in and what it had felt like at the time. He was not a reluctant participant. He described the early days of the massacre with a candor that his interviewers found difficult to sit with. He described participating in killing, and he described the psychological state in which he did so. Not passionately, not with rage, but with a kind of mechanical detachment that he attributed directly to his training. He had been told these people were not people in the relevant sense. He had believed it. The believing had happened before Nanjing, in the training camps in Japan, in the slow accumulation of language and ritual and institutional doctrine that had reclassified his capacity for empathy so that it no longer extended to Chinese civilians. Years later, as an old man, he would tour Japan, speaking about what he had done, trying to make people understand. He was not celebrated. He was often heckled by nationalist groups who denied the massacre's scale or denied his account. He continued anyway. He said that he felt compelled to speak, that silence was its own kind of continuation of the crime. He said he understood that his speaking could not undo anything. He spoke anyway. He is the exception. The machine produced exceptions rarely and suppressed them when it could. The default output was compliance, and compliance was what the machine ran on. Now move beyond Nanjing. The machine of Japanese imperial violence was vast and operated continuously across a decade and across a territory that stretched from Korea to New Guinea. It had components that are separately memorable because they are separately monstrous. Unit 731. Remember that name. The full designation was the Kwantung Army Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, a name chosen with the deliberate bureaucratic blandness of something that is meant not to attract attention. It operated out of a purpose-built complex near the town of Pingfang, outside Harbin in Manchuria. The complex covered 6 square kilometers, means it had its own power plant, its own rail spur, its own airstrip. It employed at its peak over 3,000 military and civilian staff. Its commander was Lieutenant General Ishii Shiru, a physician who held an advanced degree from Kyoto Imperial University, and who was, by every account, intellectually brilliant and completely without moral limitation. What Unit 731 produced was the most comprehensive program of human experimentation for weapons development purposes in the 20th century, rivaled only by the experiments conducted in Nazi concentration camps, and in some respects exceeding them in the systematic completeness of its methodology. Prisoners, designated in unit documents by the term maruta, which means logs, a dehumanization so thoroughgoing that it was built into the administrative vocabulary, were infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, hemorrhagic fever, and other pathogens to study infection rates, disease progression, and potential treatments. They were subjected to surgery without anesthesia, including vivisection, to study wound patterns, organ response, and blood loss. They were placed in pressure chambers at extreme altitudes until their organs failed or their eyes ruptured, to study aviation medicine. They were frozen to document the progress of frostbite at different temperatures. They were exposed to incendiary weapons to study burn injury. They were suspended upside down until they died to study the effects of gravity on blood circulation. They were subjected to centrifugal force. They were infected with syphilis, sometimes through forced intercourse with other prisoners. They were exposed to poison gas. The estimated number of people killed in Unit 731's experiments ranges from 3,000 to 10,000. The range is that wide because Ishii ordered the destruction of all records and most of the facility's physical evidence in the final weeks of the war. The prisoners who remained alive when the unit evacuated were killed. Now the transaction that follows this. After Japan's surrender, American occupation authorities became aware of Unit 731's existence and its research. General Douglas MacArthur's command made a decision. The research data, the accumulated results of a decade of lethal experimentation on human beings, was scientifically valuable. American military medicine and biological weapons programs could use it, and Ishii and his colleagues, if prosecuted, might not cooperate. More importantly, if prosecution went forward, to the Soviet Union, which was pressing for access to the research and for criminal accountability, might gain access to both Ishii and the data before America could secure them. The decision was made. immunity from prosecution in exchange for the data. Ishishiro was never tried. He died of natural causes in Tokyo in 1959 at the age of 67. He died in bed. The Bataan Death March of April and May 1942 killed between 5,000 and 18,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war through a combination of forced marching in tropical heat, starvation, dehydration, disease, and direct violence by guards who beat or bayoneted prisoners who fell behind or who were perceived to have behaved disrespectfully. The march covered 65 miles in roughly 10 days. American prisoners who survived it and lived to testify described a systematic quality to the violence. It was not random brutality by individual guards, but an institutional decision about how prisoner transfer was to be conducted, a decision that accepted prisoner deaths as an acceptable logistical outcome. The Manila Massacre of February 1945 is worth naming specifically because it is less known than Nanjing and deserves not to be. As American forces advanced on Manila and Japanese naval forces under Admiral Iwabuchi Sanji prepared to fight rather than withdraw, Japanese soldiers moved through the civilian population of the city with a systematic comprehensiveness that had become the institutional signature of Japanese military operations in occupied cities. Over the course of approximately 1 month, between 100,000 and 500,000 Filipino civilians were killed in Manila. The range of uncertainty reflects the difficulty of counting in a city that was physically destroyed in the same process. Women were raped and killed. Children were killed. Patients in hospitals were killed in their beds. People who had taken shelter in churches were killed inside the churches. The institutional doctrine that produced Manila was the same doctrine that had produced Nanjing in 1937. 8 years separated the two events. Multiple theaters and hundreds of miles separated them. They were the same thing. In Malaya and Singapore, the Suk-Ching massacres of February and March 1942 killed between 25,000 and 50,000 ethnic Chinese civilians in the first weeks of Japanese occupation. The operation was explicitly ordered as a purge of anti-Japanese elements, that when the identification of anti-Japanese elements was conducted with a thoroughness that ensured the sweep would be as wide as was operationally useful. Military-age men were screened at checkpoints. Those who had donated to Chinese war relief funds were taken. Those who had tattoos that might indicate gang membership were taken. Those whose neighbors denounced them for any reason were taken. Those who were simply unlucky enough to be at the wrong checkpoint on the wrong day were taken. The Suk-Ching was organized and executed by the Kempe Tai. The Kempe Tai that Hideki Tojo had expanded and systematized during his 3 years as its commander in Manchuria. The thread runs straight from his desk in Manchuria, to the checkpoints in Singapore, to the mass graves in the jungle outside the city. The Comfort Women System, and as it was called by the Japanese military, was a bureaucratically organized program of sexual slavery that operated across the occupied territories from the early 1930s through 1945. Women, primarily Korean and Chinese, but also Filipino, Indonesian, Dutch, and others, were recruited through deception, outright coercion, and in some cases purchase from impoverished families who were told their daughters would be employed in factories or domestic service. They were transported to military comfort stations, buildings adjacent to or within military installations, and required to service between 15 and 30 soldiers per day. The stations were administered by the military supply chain. Their establishment required authorization from divisional or higher command. Their operation was subject to military regulations, specifying things like pricing, hours, and health inspection schedules. The women were not free to leave. They were not paid in currency they could actually use. They were property of the military institution, administered like any other military resource. The estimated number of women forced into this system ranges from 20,000 to several 100,000. The range reflects the destruction of records and the decades of Japanese government resistance to full disclosure. Many of the women who survived did not come forward for decades because, in the cultures they returned to, being a comfort woman was a source of shame rather than a recognized injury deserving acknowledgement. They carried their experience in silence. Some of them carried it to their graves. All of this, Nanjing, Unit 731, the Bataan Death March, the Comfort Women System, the systematic violence against civilian populations across Southeast Asia, operated through the same institutional structure. Directives from above, transmitted through a hierarchy, implemented by people doing their jobs, with moral responsibility so distributed through the system that no single person at any level below the very top felt the full weight of what they were part of. That is how these things work. Not through exceptional evil at every level, through ordinary compliance at every level, organized by exceptional evil at the top. And at the top, moving paper, signing directives, approving budgets, chairing meetings, Hideki Tojo. August 15th, 1945. At noon on this day, the Emperor of Japan speaks to his people by radio for the first time in his reign, so the voice is thin and strange, delivered in an archaic Japanese that many of his subjects cannot fully parse. The language of the imperial court, preserved from centuries of deliberate separation from common speech. He speaks of bearing the unbearable and enduring the unendurable. He does not use the word defeat. He does not use the word surrender. He says that the war situation has developed, quote, not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that Japan must accept the joint declaration, the Allied demand for unconditional surrender, in order to preserve world peace and spare the Japanese people further suffering. The phrasing is extraordinary. World peace, as though Japan were an innocent bystander to a global conflict rather than the country that had initiated one of the two major theaters of the most destructive war in human history, and as though the suffering Japan was being spared was not primarily the continued suffering of the people Japan had been occupying, killing, enslaving, and exploiting for the previous decade. The language of the surrender announcement is the first document of what will be a long, complex, incomplete, and ongoing process of Japan coming to terms with what it did. The process has never fully concluded. But before any of that, there is the matter of Hideki Tojo. On the morning of September 11th, 1945, a group of American military police arrived at Tojo's home in the Setagaya ward of Tokyo to arrest him. Word had gotten out that they were coming, and a crowd of Japanese civilians had gathered in the street outside. Some of them had come to witness history. Some of them had come in solidarity. And some of them had simply come because a crowd had gathered and they wanted to see what was happening. Inside, Tojo had prepared. He had asked a physician friend to mark the location of his heart on his chest with a pencil, and he had positioned himself in his sitting room with a pistol. When the MPs knocked, he called out that he would be with them shortly. Then he shot himself. The bullet missed his heart by approximately an inch. The crowd outside heard the shot. The MPs broke in. Tojo was conscious, bleeding heavily, and had collapsed in his chair. American Army physicians were summoned. They gave him blood transfusions. There was a considerable debate later about whether American blood was used to keep alive the man who had ordered the attack on Pearl Harbor. This detail traveled through American press coverage with a bitterness that was understandable, if not entirely helpful to processing what had actually happened. He recovered. The missed shot became, in the years that followed, one of those historical details that people return to. that carries a kind of narrative weight beyond its literal significance. The man who had directed one of the most precisely organized military machines in the 20th century could not accurately shoot himself from arm's length. He had wanted the warrior's exit, the honorable death that would end his account before anyone else could read it. He did not get it. He got the tribunal instead. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in May 1946 in the former building of the Japanese War Ministry in Tokyo, and it was modeled on Nuremberg but differed in significant ways. 11 Allied nations participated. 28 defendants were charged across 3 classes: Class A for crimes against peace, Class B for conventional war crimes, Class C for crimes against humanity. The proceedings lasted over 2.5 years and produced a record of over 48,000 pages. Tojo was the central figure of the tribunal in the way that Goering had been central to Nuremberg. He was the highest-ranking civilian and military official in the dock who could be held directly accountable for the decisions that started the war and managed its prosecution. He was also, unlike some of his co-defendants who sought to shift blame or deny knowledge, willing to defend himself with a kind of organized directness that reflected his entire career. And he took the witness stand and testified for several days. He acknowledged his role. He acknowledged that he had been Prime Minister when the attack on Pearl Harbor was ordered, that he had been Minister of War during the central years of the China campaign, that he had held authority over the military apparatus that had conducted operations across Asia. He acknowledged these things not as confessions, but as matters of record, and he then proceeded to explain why each decision had been necessary, justified, and correct given the circumstances Japan faced. He argued that Japan had been driven to war by the economic strangulation of the American embargo, that the conflict was a war of national survival against Western colonialism and economic imperialism, and that what had been characterized as war crimes were either exaggerated, attributable to individual soldiers acting without orders, or were practices that the Allied powers themselves had engaged in. On the last point, his defense counsel introduced evidence of Allied practices that was embarrassing enough that the tribunal ruled it inadmissible. This ruling was legally controversial then and remains controversial now. The principle it represented, that defendants cannot point to the prosecution's own conduct as a defense, is a principle with serious logical problems when applied to the question of whether certain acts constitute war crimes. But the parallel that Tojo's defense was attempting to draw did not hold, even if the evidence had been admitted. The scale, the systematic character, the institutional architecture of what Japan's military had organized across a decade and across multiple occupied territories was different in kind from Allied conduct that could reasonably be characterized as war crimes. Not that Allied forces were innocent. They were not. But the Comfort Women system was not an Allied system. Unit 731 was not an Allied program. The Bataan Death March was not an Allied operation. Tojo was found guilty on multiple counts. He was sentenced to death. He was executed by hanging at Sugamo Prison on December 23, 1948, at 12:01 in the morning. He was 63 years old. 6 other defendants were hanged with him that night. Hirota Koki, a former prime minister. Generals Doihara, Itagaki, Kimura, Matsui, and Muto. They had all played different roles in different components of what we have been describing. Matsui was the theater commander at Nanjing. Doihara had managed intelligence operations in Manchuria that overlapped with Tojo's Kempei-Tai work. Each of them had been a specific cog in a specific part of the machine. 7 men, hanged, for the deaths of millions. The arithmetic of accountability in these proceedings is something worth sitting with. 7 executions for a scale of violence that stretches across a decade and a continent. The tribunal was not wrong to execute these men. But the disproportion between the punishment and the scale of what they organized is a feature of how justice works when applied to institutional violence. The institution itself cannot be executed. The ideology cannot be imprisoned. The thousands of officers and bureaucrats and physicians and transport managers who kept the machine running. Most of them went home. Most of them rebuilt their lives. Some of them became pillars of post-war Japanese society. He had converted to Buddhism in prison. He composed a death poem as tradition required, expressing hope for the spiritual rebirth of Japan and the restoration of its destiny. He expressed gratitude to the prison chaplain who administered to him. He walked to the gallows without visible distress. He did not speak of Nanjing. He did not speak of the comfort women. He did not speak of the prisoners at Bataan or the subjects of Unit 731 or the millions of civilians whose lives and deaths had been shaped by the decisions he had made at tables in buildings in Tokyo. He died as he had lived, organized, purposeful, is convinced of his own rectitude and unable to see, or unwilling to see, or constitutionally incapable of seeing the full human meaning of what he had done. The world he left behind had been transformed. China lost between 8 and 20 million people during the Second Sino-Japanese War, a range that reflects the genuine difficulty of demographic accounting in a conflict fought across a country of continental scale. The most careful current scholarship tends toward figures in the range of 10 to 14 million. These numbers resist human comprehension, and they are supposed to. The way the mind responds to them, by going slightly blank, by reaching for comparison and not quite finding one, by skipping over them to the next sentence, is a feature of the numbers themselves. They are too large. But each of those millions of deaths is a specific event, happening to a specific person, at a specific moment in a specific place. Each one was someone's child. Each one was the center of a particular world, and when that world ended, the ending was total. Korea, under Japanese colonial occupation since 1910, lost between 500,000 and 600,000 people to colonial violence, forced labor, and military conscription. Korean men were drafted into the Japanese military and worked to death in labor battalions. Korean women were taken into the comfort women's system in disproportionate numbers, to the point where Korean is the most common national identity among the survivors who have come forward to testify. The scars of the colonial period on Korean national identity run deep and are still raw in ways that periodically produce diplomatic crises between South Korea and Japan. Japan itself lost approximately 3 million people, the majority of them in the final 18 months of the war, as American bombing systematically destroyed the country's industrial base, and city after city was reduced to ash. The firebombing campaign against Japanese cities, conducted by General Curtis LeMay's B-29 force from March 1945 onward, killed somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 people over 5 months. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people immediately, with total deaths over 5 years estimated at 90,000 to 166,000. The atomic bombing of Nagasaki 3 days later killed between 40,000 and 80,000. These are the deaths that Japan most remembers and most marks publicly. This is not entirely Japan's fault. The atomic bombings were genuinely unprecedented, genuinely horrifying, and genuinely a moment that required the world to confront something new about what human beings were now capable of doing to each other. Hiroshima and Nagasaki deserved the attention they received. But the attention they received, especially within Japan, had the effect of positioning Japan as victim in a narrative that required careful editing to sustain. The positioning was not false. The civilians of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were victims, unambiguously. But it was incomplete in ways that would shape Japan's post-war self-understanding for generations. How has Japan reckoned with what it did? This is a question that requires honesty about both the reckoning that has occurred and the reckoning that has not. Japan has, at the official level, acknowledged the Nanjing Massacre. A 1995 statement by Prime Minister Murayama Tomiichi offered what is widely considered the most comprehensive official apology Japan has made for its wartime conduct, expressing remorse for colonialism and aggression, and acknowledging the suffering Japan caused to peoples in Asia. The Kono Statement of 1993 acknowledged government involvement in the comfort women system. Japan has paid reparations to some countries in the form of economic assistance packages. These acknowledgments are real, but they have been repeatedly undercut by actions and statements that read, in the countries most affected, as revocation rather than reaffirmation. Japanese government officials who visit Yasukuni Shrine, where the souls of 14 Class A war criminals, including Tojo, were enshrined in 1978, do so in ways that provoke diplomatic crises with China and South Korea every time it happens. High school textbooks that describe Nanjing with minimal detail or with language that softens the Japanese military's role have been approved and used in some schools. Politicians who characterize the comfort women system as voluntary have held senior positions in government. The contrast with Germany is instructive and uncomfortable. Germany built a memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe at the center of its capital. Germany made Holocaust denial a crime. And Germany embedded the acknowledgement of what it did into the constitutional and educational and cultural framework of the post-war state, in ways that made denial not just illegal, but socially unthinkable in mainstream society. German chancellors kneel at memorials to Jewish victims. The gesture is understood to be genuine because the institutions around it are genuine. Japan has done none of these things at equivalent scale or depth, and the reasons why are complex. And they begin with a decision made by the American occupation authorities in 1945. The decision to preserve the emperor. Hirohito reigned until 1989. He was never tried. He was never required to publicly account for his role in the war. The imperial institution, around which the entire ideology of divine authority and martial sacrifice had been organized, he was allowed to continue under the fiction that the emperor had been a constitutional monarch with limited authority over military decisions. Many historians regard this as false, or at least as a significant simplification of a more complex reality. But it was the decision MacArthur made, on the calculation that the emperor's authority was necessary for peaceful occupation and reconstruction. The decision preserved stability. It also preserved the ideological center of what had produced the war, covered with a thin layer of new doctrine that said, "That was then, this is different. The emperor is now a symbol of peace." Prince Asaka, who ordered the killing of all prisoners in Nanjing, was never tried. He received immunity as a member of the imperial family. He lived until 1981 and died at the age of 93, having apparently never publicly discussed his role in Nanjing. Ishii Shiro, the physician who ran Unit 731, received immunity in exchange for his data and died in Tokyo at 67 of natural causes. These men died in their beds. Tojo's granddaughter, Tojo Yuko, has served as a member of Japan's National Diet, the lower house of parliament, as a member of the Liberal Democratic Party. She has publicly defended her grandfather's legacy, argued that the Tokyo trials were victor's justice rather than legitimate legal accountability, and stated that her grandfather did not deserve his classification as a war criminal. She has visited Yasukuni Shrine. She is entitled to love her grandfather. The love of a grandchild for a grandparent is not something history can or should reach. She is not entitled to revise what he did. The Chinese government estimates 300,000 dead in Nanjing. Some Japanese historians put the figure at 40,000. Some put it higher than the Chinese estimate. The International Military Tribunal found evidence for around 200,000. The gap between these figures has become a political battlefield, with the numbers weaponized by all sides in ways that sometimes make genuine historical analysis difficult. But here is what is not disputed. Tens of thousands of people, at minimum, were killed in a deliberate, systematic 6-week campaign of organized violence by Japanese military forces, following the capture of an already surrendered city. The question of whether it was 40,000 or 300,000 is, from the perspective of each individual killed, a question that answers itself. Let's end somewhere specific. In the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall, built on the site of one of the largest mass graves discovered outside the city walls, there's a room called the Hall of Victims' Names. The walls are covered with individual names in small, dense text. They are the names of identified victims, people for whom records survive or whose family members came forward to register a death. The names have been gathered over decades by historians, archivists, and ordinary people who understood that keeping the name is the last act available for someone who can no longer keep it themselves. The names are printed in a font small enough that the room can hold tens of thousands of them, and still the names cover only a fraction of the dead. The room holds the identified. The unidentified are the majority. They have the absence of a name in this room, which is its own kind of monument, a negative space that describes, by its emptiness, the scale of what was done. There is a specific form of grief that belongs to the families of the unnamed, the family that knows their person died in Nanjing or Manila or Singapore or on the Bataan Road, but has no grave, no documented moment of death, no official record, only the fact of absence and the knowledge, passed down through generations, of what that absence means. These families exist in their millions across Asia. Their grief is not historical in the sense that it belongs to the past. It is present. It is alive. It is something that the living carry, because the institutions that could provide closure have not provided it, because the acknowledgement that would allow mourning to complete itself has been withheld or qualified or retracted. And at the entrance to the memorial complex in Nanjing, there is a stone figure, a mother, arms outstretched, looking at the sky. She has been there since the memorial opened. Millions of people have walked past her. Some are Chinese, descendants of survivors, people with specific reason to be there. Some are students on school trips, encountering this history for the first time in a form that is impossible to look away from. Some are tourists from other countries who came expecting a museum and found something that required more of them than they had anticipated. Some are Japanese, which takes a particular courage to stand in that place and look honestly at what your country did. All of them walk past the stone mother with her arms outstretched. None of them can give her what she's asking for. What she is asking for cannot be given. It is in the category of the irreversible. It happened. It cannot be made not to have happened. The only thing available now is the choice of how to hold it, whether to account for it honestly, to keep the names, to refuse the comfortable story, or to do what states and individuals most often prefer to do with the hardest truths about themselves, which is to find the version that requires the least from them and settle into it. Japan has not fully resolved this choice. It is still making it in its textbooks and its political decisions and its memorials and its silences. The choice is not made once. It is made over and over in different contexts by different people, and the cumulative result of all those individual choices is what we call a nation's relationship to its history. Japan's relationship to this particular history is still being determined. That matters to people who are still alive. It matters to the grandchildren of the dead, who carry the absence of names. It matters to the countries that share a region with Japan, for whom the question of whether Japan fully reckons with what it did is not an academic question, but a practical one about trust and relationship, and the construction of a different future than the one the past would otherwise determine. Hideki Tojo sat at a table. He signed his name to documents. He managed a machine that killed millions of people with the precision and consistency of industrial production. He believed he was right. He believed he was serving something greater than himself. He believed, as men like him always believe, and that the necessity of what he was doing absolved him of the meaning of what he was doing, that the historical scale of the goal made the human cost of the process a secondary consideration, that the empire required this, that Japan required this, that destiny required this. He was wrong, not wrong in a subtle or contested way, wrong in the way that becomes clear when you stand in a room full of names and understand that each name is a person who had breakfast one morning and did not have breakfast the next morning because of decisions made at tables in buildings in Tokyo. The machine Tojo built is gone. The empire he served is gone. But the machine is a template, and templates survive their original implementations. The logic that says, these people are obstacles rather than persons, that says efficiency is more important than mercy, that says the historical scale of our project places it beyond ordinary moral accounting. This logic is not extinct. It does not require samurai myth or imperial divinity or the specific pathologies of 1930s Japan to function. It requires only an institution sufficiently enclosed, an ideology sufficiently complete, and a man sufficiently committed to the institution and the ideology that the question of what it costs in human terms never fully forms. What we owe the dead is refusal. Refusal to look away, refusal to accept the accounting that says some deaths are administrative and some are moral, that some lives are variables and some are persons. Refusal to let the names become numbers and the numbers become statistics and the statistics become the kind of historical background noise that stops feeling like anything at all. The woman at the entrance to the memorial is still holding her arms out. We will see you next time.